All right, so the topic for today is macroevolution, which means big evolution. Up until now, we've been talking about microevolution, which is just the changes in the frequencies of alleles in a population, which can happen at any time, really, due to many different events. But how do we actually take all these little changes and make a whole new species from it? And that's what we talk about in macroevolution. So how do we go from these two guys right here to making a mammal? And it's not that simple, but it's a process. So how does that process actually occur? The first thing we need to realize is that Charles Darwin, even though he knew a lot and he did a lot, he did not understand how new species actually came about. So he saw that there was all this wonderful variation. He knew that organisms competed for resources, that they overproduced offspring. But his mystery of mysteries was, how does it actually happen? How do you get from species A to species A, B, C, and maybe even D? So Charles gave us a good starting point, but he didn't understand how it actually, the mechanism maybe behind it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But first we have to talk about what is a species, because to say if you're part of the same species, you actually have to know what a species is. And there are many different concepts of species, but we're going to go with the biological species concept. And what that means is this right here. It means that the members of this group, this species, can interbreed, and not just that, but they produce viable, fertile offspring. So their offspring are going to be healthy, and they're going to be fertile, which means they can have their own offspring. And it was defined by this guy, Ernest. Here he is hanging out in the corner up here. And one of the things that we need to realize is that now that we have more information, as technology has grown, we can learn more about species on a more fundamental level. So if we look at the picture of these humans over here, if we just look at them, they all look very different. But any one of these humans can have offspring with any one of the other humans. So just going off of looks alone might not be enough. Conversely, these two meadowlarks look very similar, but they don't interbreed. They can't produce fertile offspring because of other reasons. So you could have two groups that look very similar that don't meet this species concept, and you can have groups of organisms that look very different that do meet the species concept. So that's why we have to define what a species is. And looking alone, morphology alone, is not going to be enough. And they have to be reproductively compatible, which means that they are going to be able to exchange genes and share the same gene pool between them. So how does this happen? How does it happen? Why does it happen? It's a long process. It's not overnight. There are multiple changes that are going to have to happen. It doesn't mean that it can't occur rapidly, and it doesn't mean that sometimes it's not going to occur really, really slowly. It's just dependent on the species and the situation. But ultimately, the populations are going to become what we call reproductively isolated from each other. So at that point, they are no longer exchanging genes between the populations because they're not mating and producing fertile offspring. So they become isolated, even if they still live in the same area. So they don't have to be physically separated, but they need to be reproductively separated. And we have two major ways that this can happen: prezygotic barriers and postzygotic barriers. So prezygotic barriers mean pre-zygote. So egg and sperm cannot or will not come together in these cases. Postzygotic barriers mean egg and sperm have fused, they have met, they have fused, and a zygote has been created, but then something else is going to occur after that that keeps these two populations reproductively separate from each other. And ultimately, what's going to happen over time, as we accumulate more differences, they're going to evolve independently of each other. So there are going to be differences that accumulate in population A that maybe don't accumulate in population B because they are no longer exchanging genes. And there are two types of isolation. So allopatric is of actual physical separation. Something has happened where these populations are physically separated by some type of geographic barrier. So in this figure over here, we have our original population of fish. And let's say it's dry season, or it's just major times of drought. And what was once a very large lake breaks up into two smaller bodies of water. And over time, because fish from group A cannot mate with fish from group B, they're going to evolve separately from each other. Conversely, you have something called sympatric. And these fish are still living in the same area, so like the picture on the right, but for another reason. They are choosing not to mate with each other. And in both cases, you can have a new species arise, you can have speciation occur, but the mechanism behind it is going to be different. So let's talk about prezygotic barriers. So again, prezygotic, before a zygote is made. So egg and sperm, again, not coming together. And here are the types. And we're going to go over each of these in detail. But there are many reasons that egg and sperm might not be able to come together. So for every group that you talk about, for every case that you talk about, there might be a different reason. But still, the end result is the same. No zygote is made. So the first one we have is geographic isolation. And that means that the populations are separated by a fairly large, for them, barrier. So they inhabit two totally different areas. And most of the time this physical barrier is impassable to them. So for our example, we have the Harris antelope squirrel. And think about this on the Grand Canyon. That canyon is very, very large. These squirrels are not going to be able to cross it in order to mate with each other. So the squirrels on one end are going to mate with each other, and the squirrels on the other end are going to mate with each other because they just don't meet in nature. So there's no chance that egg and sperm are going to come in contact. And this is a huge example of allopatric speciation. Again, they are not meeting. There's no chance that they are going to be able to mate with one another and produce fertile offspring. And what allopatric actually means is other country. Allo, other, patric, country. And it doesn't literally mean other country. In this case, they're not living in two separate countries, but they might as well be. Ecological isolation is a same kind of idea, but a little bit different. So the species can occur in the same region, but occupy different habitats in that region. So because of that, they do become reproductively isolated. So it's maybe slightly more likely that they would meet with each other in passing, but they're not mating. So our two species of garter snake right here. They live in the same area. This guy right here lives on land. This guy lives in the water. And because of that very simple distinction, they're really not mating with each other because they live in two separate areas. So lions and tigers could hybridize. So most lions live in Africa, which would be geographic isolation because most tigers live in Asia. But there is a species of Asiatic lion, but they live in different habitats. They don't really meet with each other in the wild. But in zoos or game reserves or some kind of ecological preserve, humans like to mate them and make ligers, which is this right here. This is Hercules, and he is a huge liger. He is about 500 pounds, but his fertility is unknown. He doesn't have any offspring right now, but I don't think they've done any fertility tests on him. So the next one is temporal isolation. So temporal meaning time. So we have two species, like our little skunks right here, that live in the same area. They can meet with each other, but because they breed at two different times of the year, are not going to be able to exchange gametes. So one of these skunks breeds in the late winter, the other in the late summer. So there's just not time. They're just not compatible time-wise. And a lot of this is based on female compatibility. So the females come into estrus or come into heat at specific times of the year. So there's really no way for any type of exchange of gametes between the two. And this would be sympatric speciation. So sym meaning same, patric meaning country. They're together, they meet with each other all the time, but it's another reason. It's the timing. The timing is off. And then you have behavioral isolation. This is really common with birds and some insects, and they have unique behavior patterns. So different types of birds do different mating dances. Especially the males will have certain things they need to do to attract females. And what that's going to help do is because a lot of times you have a bunch of different groups of these organisms living together, it's going to help members of the same species recognize each other. It's called mate recognition. So by doing the correct dance or the correct call, the female can identify that this is a male of the same group as them and they will mate. And you can take a moment if you want and watch the videos, Blue-Footed Boobies or Birds of Paradise, because they are both really good. But behavioral isolation, you're doing something to attract a mate that is specific to your group. Some other examples, another courtship display of the cranes in Kenya. So they're going to do a dance. These little insects, these are lacewings, sing at different frequencies, which are only recognized by members of their same group. And the one I think is the best or the most interesting is fireflies light up in certain patterns to attract mates of their own kind. So to you or I, it would just be that the firefly is lighting up. But to other fireflies, that could be a signal for reproductive readiness. Then you have mechanical isolation. So this is morphological. Physical differences prevent mating from happening. So this can be really common in plants. So these two types of plants are called monkey flowers. And they're really closely related to each other, even though they might not look like it. The one at the top in red has a very long tubular structure. And the reason for that is it co-evolved with this hummingbird. The hummingbird is its pollinator, and the hummingbird's beak is very long and thin, so it's going to be very easy for the hummingbird to help pollinate it. Conversely, this guy down here, this pink monkey flower, it's very wide, and the parts in here, the reproductive parts, are close together. So a bee is going to do a really great job at helping pollinate this flower. If a hummingbird tried to pollinate this flower, it wouldn't really work. And same thing for up here. If a bee tried to, pollinate this flower, it wouldn't work as well. This doesn't only happen in plants, but for some insects, this becomes a very large problem. So you have these things called damselflies, which would look like dragonflies to us. And different types of damselflies, if you look right down here, different types of damselflies have different shaped penises. And if damselfly male A tries to mate with damselfly from female of group C, it's not going to work because the parts are not going to fit together. So not mostly an issue for many organisms, but for certain species, this can become a really, really big issue. So mechanical isolation, parts do not fit. And the very last prezygotic barrier is gametic isolation. So in this case, egg and sperm will meet. They're in the same place at the same time, but for another reason, fertilization cannot occur. And generally there are two things that could prevent this. The first is biochemical. So sperm and egg need to meet up kind of like a lock and a key. So if the sperm doesn't have the correct proteins on its surface to meet with the correct receptors on the egg, then the egg is not going to let it in. So they could meet, but sperm cannot penetrate the egg because it doesn't have the right, lock to fit, or the key, to fit in the lock. Another way is chemical incompatibility. So in this case, the sperm gets into the female's reproductive tract, but because of some chemical in there, the sperm die off before they can even reach the egg. So they're never going to make it. Our example of this is sea urchins. So we have red and purple sea urchins that live in the same area, and how they reproduce is they release their gametes into the water. So the gametes just kind of float around and hopefully fertilization occurs. Well, a red and a purple, if their gametes were to meet, which they often do, they can't fuse together. It's just not possible because, again, this kind of lock and key thing, they don't have the right pieces that fit together to allow the sperm into that egg for fertilization. All right, so that was all the pre-zygotic, before we even make a baby. But what if you can make a baby? Those are post-reproduction, or better yet, post-zygotic barriers. So something else occurs to prevent this offspring that we make from turning into a viable, healthy, remember that means healthy, fertile adult. And there are 3 different types. So the first one is reduced hybrid viability. And remember, viability means healthiness. So we can make an offspring initially, but because the genes of the parents interact inside those cells in incorrect ways, often the hybrid doesn't even survive, maybe beyond a few cell divisions. And on the off chance that you do get an offspring that develops, they don't live that long, and they might be very frail, like our little salamanders. So the offspring is just not healthy. It's not going to do what it needs to do to survive, especially to reproductive age. Then you have reduced hybrid fertility. So you mate and make a really healthy offspring, but that offspring can't have its own offspring. So the classic example is horses mating with donkeys to create a mule, which are really common on farms. Mules are really strong, they're really healthy, but in most cases, because each parent, horses have 64 chromosomes and donkeys have 62 chromosomes, when the mule goes to make its own eggs or sperm, its own gametes, the gametes don't get made correctly because it has an odd number of chromosomes. Not everything is paired up, and that's going to cause a lot of problems during meiosis. So you're not going to make healthy gametes. But the offspring itself is healthy. And the last one is hybrid breakdown. So you cross 2 different species, you make a hybrid. The first generation, your F1 generation, is great. They're viable, super healthy, very fertile. But because of a kind of increase in the recessive alleles, when these hybrids mate, when your F1 hybrids mate, their offspring start going downhill. They become very weak or sterile. So it's not the first offspring, it's when those offspring try to have babies. Their offspring are not healthy or not fertile, or maybe both. So how quickly does this happen? Does it happen really fast? Does it happen really slow? Or is it maybe a little bit of both? There are 2 schools of thought. So the first one is gradualism. Good old Charles was a huge proponent of this, Charles Darwin. And then we have something called punctuated equilibrium. So we're going to look at both. So gradualism is the idea that this change from one species to another is very slow and even. And if you look at the diagram, there's kind of the same amount of space in between all of these forms. So the changes accumulate, and then we get a new species. And then over the same kind of amount of time, new changes accumulate, and we get a new species. And this is very slow and even. And for some species, this might work. If there's not like a huge change in selective pressure, nothing really has happened, this might be the case for species that haven't really changed much. It doesn't mean that they're not accumulating little changes, but it might take longer because the environment pressure is not different. But conversely, you have the idea of punctuated equilibrium. So that means for a long time, nothing changes. But then something maybe in the environment changes, and you get rapid bursts of speciation. So nothing changes, and then boom, new species. And then nothing changes for a while, and then maybe we get a new species eventually. Think about when the dinosaurs went extinct. So the dinosaurs go extinct, all of a sudden there is all this room in the environment. There are all these niches, all these roles that mammals can now fill. So you had a burst of speciation after a mass extinction event. So the idea is that maybe it's a little bit of both of these things, and it just depends on the environment and the species that you're talking about, whether it's going to be gradualism or punctuated equilibrium. So that is the end of our presentation for speciation / macroevolution.